This is 5 Live Sport.
Froch starts to unload, right in front of it, lands a big right hand and another. Froch lands an even bigger right hand.
Carl's got to get straight on him, jump on him and finish this fight.
Good left hook from Froch, good right hand from Froch.
Froch is unloading, oh he's got the fight, has he?
A right hand from Froch, the two men are swinging away. Wild West style in the centre of the ring.
He is at the top level in this sport of boxing at super-middleweight.
Froch opens up and Froch is producing a sensational finish.
That was a remarkable turnaround by Carl Froch. That is something out of a Rocky movie, I promise you.
An overhand right from Carl Froch on the ropes just above us, and it is all over. One single sharp right hand from Carl Froch. George Groves sent tumbling to the canvas. He is still the world champion.
Fantastic memories. He gave us some of the best nights in British boxing in recent history. Today he retired a 4-time world champion. For the next half hour we reflect on the career of Carl Froch. Joining me in the studio, 5 Live's boxing correspondent who you heard commentating on some of those terrific Froch moments, Mike Costello, and boxing journalist Steve Bunce as well. Good evening to you both, gentlemen.
Hello, George.
Mike, not unexpected first of all, but nonetheless the end of an era.
Yes, and an era of almost guaranteed entertainment every time Froch clambered through the ropes, and I think it'll be a long time before we see his like again here in Britain in terms of what he brought to the sport, his toughness, his resilience, his ability to ship punishment and respond. 12 world title fights in a row, what a run, finishing with that breathtaking knockout of George Groves we just heard there, and he leaves the sport on a win, on his own terms, healthy in more ways than one, and not many boxers can say that.
And listening to Carl Froch when he was speaking to us, Steve, on 5 Live Breakfast this morning, he's pretty firm in his own mind. This is the right call. Do you agree that it is?
Absolutely, 100%. He's left with his marbles, he's left with his millions, and he's left on Carl Froch's terms. He's been talking about it for a while, and I truly believe, and I think Mike would as well, I think he knew the moment that right hand landed on George Groves' chin in front of 80,000 people at Wembley last May, I think he knew in his heart of hearts that was it. And with each day, I think he was even more sure. He couldn't even make out he was contemplating a return. It's the best decision, it's the right decision, and it's Carl's decision.
You've known Carl, Mike, for a long time, since he was part of a very talented Great Britain amateur squad.
Yes, back in the days when he wore a vest in the ring. I made a documentary about him for BBC World Service in May 2001, just before the World Amateur Championships of that year in Belfast, and before he turned professional. At the time, BBC Television was still covering amateur boxing on a regular basis, and I was working back then as the ringside interviewer, and so got to know some of the amateur boxers around at the time quite well. And for a half-hour documentary on a single boxer, I knew that whoever it was would have to be a good talker who could express himself. And I remember being very impressed by Froch in the post-fight interviews that I'd done with him. So we got together and agreed to meet up at various training venues at various points over a period of a few weeks in the lead up to those championships in Belfast, where he was representing England. And at that stage, no English boxer had ever won a medal at the World Championships. And the first time we linked up in training all those years ago was for one of his early morning runs.
Yeah, I suppose it's not very glamorous getting up in the morning, running around the streets or around the local park, but it's an essential part of my daily training, so it's got to be done.
I guess it's easier on a glorious spring day like today, but in the winter time it gets really tough.
That's right, yeah, you get your rain mac on, your woolly hat and your gloves, and you still have to get out there. Rain, snow, wind, everything, you have to do it. It's all part of the fitness training, so it's all good though, enjoy it.
So how old are you now?
23.
And how long have you been boxing?
About 12 years.
And this big test coming up, the World Amateur Championships in Belfast, by far the biggest test of your career so far.
Yeah, most definitely. World Championships gives me a chance to be recognised among the best in the world, if not the best. So I'll get my world ranking after this. Hopefully I'll be ranked number 1 if I can pull that gold medal back that I've been dreaming about.
And there are many others around the world doing exactly as you're doing right now, training for the big night.
That's right. Sometimes I think about that as motivation. How hard can I train? How hard am I training? And then think about how hard the next man might be training. So if I train to my full limits, everyone's only human. As long as I push myself, then hopefully I'll be up there with them.
And ultimately you dream, I guess, of professional glory?
yeah, in the future one day, I mean, I started out boxing looking at the likes of Muhammad Ali and even more recently Prince Nassim, spurred me on to look at great success and big things, think about it a lot, dream about it, one day be up there with a world title shot at the doorstep, dragging in all the fame and glory and fortune that goes with it, but more importantly all the prestige of the performing for my country and for myself as well.
Makes me exhausted just listening to that piece of audio. Steve Bunce, just a little insight into the kind of dedication and focus not only required for any pro boxer, but one that remained throughout Carl Froch's career.
Yeah, what you also have to understand is, as he was 23 there, so he wasn't an instant star at 19, filled with, free tracksuits and trips around the world. He had it hard. He lost in the domestic championships a couple of times. He sort of came late to that stardom. And what happened the year before the World Amateur Championships is he got absolutely stitched up by the politics that exists in amateur boxing when he was meant to have an Olympic qualifying contest in Liverpool, and his opponent made out he wasn't his opponent. He made out he was someone else, and they used fake ID to get out of the fight. Had Carl fought that guy, he would have gone to the Sydney Olympics.
He turned pro, Mike, in 2002. 23 fights in a row were won, and that landed a first world title shot, didn't it, in 2008?
Yes, against the teak-tough Canadian called Jean Pascal, and the win for Froch that night was endorsed later in his career when Jean Pascal went on to take a world title in the light heavyweight division as well. But it also set the standard for what was to come and what we should expect from Froch in the later years in his career, because it was 12 rounds of brutality, and Carl Froch time and again took heavy punishment, was throwing punches from wide angles and almost nonchalant really, and almost ignoring his own defence. And it was a memorable fight to win the title. It was the vacant WBC version of the super-middleweight title at 12 stone, and there that night in front of ITV viewers, actually, that was broadcast on ITV that night, so a terrestrial TV audience, we really thought that his star would shine for a long time to come, but it wasn't to be. But certainly within the boxing community at that stage, we realised that someone special had arrived on the world title scene. 12
rounds of brutality, Steve Bunce, as Mike describes. It's something that Carl Froch was very capable of, even though he had this terrific knockout percentage in the early years too.
Yeah, he was taking people out when he had to take people out, but once he stepped up, once he moved to Pascal, and then in fact the next 6 fights, 7 of them, I know one of them ended, we'll talk about it in a second, with 14 seconds left, but he essentially had 7 12-round world title fights on the spin, a consecutive sequence against such quality that it will never ever be repeated because of the way the modern sport has evolved. It will never happen again that a British boxer has 7 consecutive world title fights against men as good as the 7 he fought.
Well, you set it up perfectly. Perhaps the most dramatic fight in Froch's career, that first defence of the world's title against former undisputed middleweight champ Jermaine Taylor. Mike, he was already a world champion, but how much did this fight do for the profile of Carl Froch at this stage?
Well, yes, as you say, I think we were already beginning to realise that nothing would be ordinary in the career and the fights of Carl Froch, and the manner of the win against Jermaine Taylor marked him out as a character of this unbreakable spirit that would become a defining character of his whole makeup. Jermaine Taylor was a fighter with a very impressive pedigree. At the Olympics in 2000 that Steve referred to, that Froch failed to qualify for, he won a bronze medal there at Sydney. And then in his professional career, 2 of his most impressive wins at that stage, and we're talking in the early part of 2009, were wins against the great Bernard Hopkins. For Froch, as you say, this was his first defence. It was in the United States, in Connecticut, and he was knocked down by Taylor in the 3rd round, and that was the first knockdown of Froch's career. And Taylor that night, certainly through the first 2/3 of the fight, was in the kind of form that he showed against Bernard Hopkins. For a lot of the fight, as far as Froch was concerned, he was untouchable, in particular with brilliant work with his left hand. And after 11 rounds, 2 of the judges had Froch 4 rounds behind, and my scorecard was exactly the same.
So we arrive at this point, losing on the scorecards, less than a minute to go in the final round, and here's what happened next.
Froch is tired, Taylor is tired, 45 seconds to go, right hand again, and Taylor is down, finally, with 40 seconds to go. in the 12th and final round. He was ahead on points. The referee reaches 7, 8. The standing 8 count. The referee waves them in again. 25 seconds to go. Right hand from Froch. They're in Taylor's own corner. Can he finish it before the bell? Taylor has no response. The referee has stepped in. It's all over. We have seen one of the most remarkable turnarounds in World Championship boxing history.
Absolutely extraordinary. It had to finish then as well, Mike, I think, for the sake of your voice. But an ending straight from Hollywood, this, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And as I said, he was on the end of so much punishment throughout the contest, but he just didn't stop trying to close down the ring space between himself and Jermaine Taylor. And I remember saying in commentary, I was there with Duke McKenzie at ringside, you heard him yelping there as well, that he just couldn't believe it. At the end of the 11th round, because of where we sit and how we sit as commentators at ringside, generally speaking, our eye line is at the level of the fighters' calves. And at the end of the 11th round, that penultimate round, just as the two fighters were separated by the referee to go back to their corners, we thought we saw the legs of Jermaine Taylor just slightly wilt, and we wondered whether he'd given everything in those first 11 rounds and whether 3 minutes would be enough for Froch to turn it round. And in the end, he did it with 14 seconds remaining, and one of the most remarkable victories, not just by a British boxer, but by anybody in World Championship history. That's a rare turnaround.
What were you thinking into that final round, Steve Bunce?
Well, I was thinking exactly the same thing as Mike. I knew enough about Carl Froch to never write him off. But, you know, there's Rocky, there's fantasy, and then there's real boxing. And what Carl managed to do in that particular 3-minute section was combine all three of them. In my heart of hearts, I knew he could do it. But did I really think he could? Of course I didn't.
So to the setbacks. In 2010 and 2011, having won his first 26 professional fights, Froch lost twice as part of the Super 6 tournament. Let's start with the Mikhail Kessler fight. This was a really tight one, wasn't it, Mike? Froch says that if this had been a home fight for him, so in Nottingham, he would have got the decision here.
Yes, and it's not making an excuse for him. It's a valid reason that on the Sunday before the fight took place, so 6 days out, he genuinely thought the fight was off, so much so that he organised a family barbecue. And he thought the fight was off because of this volcanic ash cloud, you might remember, had erupted over Iceland and spread across much of Europe. And it was pretty much accepted that none of us will be able to fly there. It was going to be very difficult to get there by boat and then by road. And for a world title fight, Froch wasn't going to put himself through that. In the end, the cloud cleared on the Tuesday and Wednesday of the following week, and so he did fly by private jet into the venue in Herning. He flew first of all to Copenhagen in Denmark and then on to Herning, and so his preparations were interrupted. But even so, against Mikhail Kessler, in Mikhail Kessler's homeland, it was another of those memorable fights that for a lot of the fight could have gone either way. I thought Kessler did enough to win the fight, but without that kind of interruption to his build-up, you'd have to have given Froch a better chance.
And he would avenge that defeat, Steve, as well.
Yeah, he would. In fact, in the most glorious of circumstances at the O2 in London, an absolute capacity crowd, and another sensational fight. Those two guys fought 24 rounds, and if you want to be brutal about it, if you want to really do it up, I'd say it was about 12-12 in rounds, although one judge in Herning managed to score it 9-3, which was both a joke and an insult to Carl Froch on that particular night.
The second defeat the following year to Andre Ward, far more comprehensive. Mike, as great as Carl Froch was, Andre Ward just a level above.
Yes, and I think he ran into somebody who, for me, ranks alongside and just beneath Floyd Mayweather among the very best in the world at the moment. We haven't seen a lot of him in the last couple of years because of promotional and managerial wrangles, but Andre Ward on that night I thought was really special. And what was telling for me, George, was afterwards, you know, I was talking earlier there about how I've done many interviews down the years with Carl Froch. After the fight, I spoke to Froch, we recorded something. When I stopped recording, because during the recording of the post-fight interview, he was saying how he thought it was close and he wants a rematch and he can beat him next time. And then when I switched off my machine, he looked at me and he said, "It wasn't close, was it, Mike?" And I said, "No, it wasn't." And he said, I know it wasn't close because my hands are not hurting. Normally at this stage of a night, I can't wait to get the gloves off and the bandages off, but tonight my hands are not hurting. And that's because he couldn't land cleanly enough on Andre Ward and often enough.
You've spoken to Andre Ward earlier today, Mike. He's still unbeaten. Let's have a listen to this. Here's how he remembers that fight with Froch.
It wasn't so much about punching power or strength or anything like that. I think his competitiveness is probably his greatest asset, and I think my competitiveness is one of my greatest assets. Neither one of us are the biggest, strongest, the fastest in the division, but one thing that you can't take from either one of us is our competitiveness. And he didn't want to lose to me any more than I wanted to lose to him. And, you know, I think that that's the main thing that I felt and sensed from him, not leading up to the fight, but actually in the fight, was just his competitiveness and his desire to battle, you know, when things got rough or, you know, deep, late in the fight. You know, when guys literally, you know, like to take their foot off the gas, you know, he would step on the gas because he wanted to win that bad, and I answered the call right back. So, you know, I really appreciate, you know, the way he goes about things. I mean, there is, you know, especially with the internet and social media, man, there's a lot of fluff in the game right now. There's a lot of individuals who are talking a good game, but they're not backing it up. You know, their promoters are talking a good game, that behind the scenes they're not willing to step up, and you have to give Froch credit, if nothing else, for stepping up and being willing to face the best, from Joe Calzaghe all the way down to Jermaine Taylor, and the list goes on, and not just step up, but actually defeat the best. So, great fighter, in my opinion.
And in terms of your career, 28 fights unbeaten, you went through the Super 6 and beat Froch in the final. Where does he rank among your opponents? Is he the hardest man you ever fought?
I don't know if he's the hardest man. I would have to take some time to think about that. You know, being an active fighter and again, being as competitive as I am, I don't view it. I just view it a little bit differently right now. Maybe when my career is over, I'll be a little bit more reflective and introspective on, you know, who was the toughest, who hit the hardest. I'm kind of in the moment right now, but I will rank him up as one of my funnest fights in terms of just, you know, a fight that I felt I had to win and I didn't want to lose to that guy. And just, again, what he brought to the table. You know, he brought a lot of bravado. He brought a lot of big talk. And most of the time he was able to back that big talk up, and I respect him for that.
And the fight that we called for here in the UK, Andre, that didn't happen, partly because their careers only just overlapped, was against Joe Calzaghe. A Calzaghe at his peak against Froch at his peak. Who wins?
It's a tough call. Got a lot of respect for Joe. Got a lot of respect for Froch. Two totally different styles. But again, that's one of Joe Calzaghe's greatest assets, is his competitiveness. So, you know, I think it would have been a barn burner. I mean, I think, you know, some would lean toward Joe as far as the volume punching and the, you know, the angles and the southpaw stance and his boxing ability. But then you're going to have those who would push for Froch and say, man, he's got a chin, he's got desire to win, and he's going to be there all night long. So I just think that's a great battle that unfortunately the UK and the world never got a chance to see. But much respect to both guys.
And unfortunately, we didn't get to see the rematch against you either, Andre. But thank you very much for sparing the time to talk to us, as ever.
Thank you so much. Andre
Ward with my Steve Bunce high-ish praise there, without wanting to give him or be heard to give him too much credit.
Well, it was a great get out. He said, I'm still active, so I'm going to reflect on it when I retire. That was brilliant. I was with Froch a couple of weeks ago when he was doing an after-dinner speaking engagement up here in Staffordshire, in the Midlands, and he said to me that he thought that Andre Ward at his best is actually unbeatable. And I looked at him and went, yeah. He said, he's unbeatable, Steve. He said, but even by me, he said he's unbeatable. So you talk about praise. That's praise coming from Froch, who, by the way, isn't a man generally connected with sentences including praise.
Mike, just a quick word on that Calzaghe fight you mentioned with Andre Ward there. As a boxing fan as you are, how disappointed were you that never happened?
Well, I think, yes, their careers overlapped, but was Joe Calzaghe at his peak when Carl Froch was at his peak? I don't think that's the case. And so I'm not so sure it's that, you know, that much hyped fight that a lot of people are pretending it would be. At their peaks, my view is that Joe Calzaghe would have beaten Carl Froch, but I'm not so sure, on the other hand, whether Joe Calzaghe would have been able to rack up 12 world title fights against such opposition as Carl Froch did. I noticed in Boxing News this week an interview with Steve Collins, who was part of that great era with Nigel Benn and Michael Watson and Chris Eubank, and he said, going back right to that era and up to and including Joe Calzaghe, that for him, Carl Froch stands out amongst the whole pack of British and Irish super middleweights, if you like, and that's some praise. And I would point out just quickly as well, having just heard from Andre Ward and spoken earlier about the Mikael Kessler fight, I think that the two best performances of Carl Froch's career were the performances immediately after defeats, and they were against Arthur Abraham, who he comprehensively beat on points, and then after losing to Ward, he then battered Lucien Boutet to defeat in 5 rounds in a fight in which he started second favourite, as he did against Abraham. And I just think that's a measure of the quality of the man, the calibre of his resilience, that after his defeat he came back to produce, for me, the best 2 performances of his career.
Yeah, that's the consecutive sequencing that I was talking about, and that when you look at the record and you look at the stats and you even watch the fights, it's never been done before, and it will never happen again because of the way our business has changed.
So, after that second Kessler fight, Froch had avenged a tough defeat. A 4-time world champion as he was, 2 world titles. He could have retired then in 2013 with a legacy to match the great British super middleweights. We know what happened next. 2 fights with George Groves, his mandatory challenger. Let's remember how that second fight finished.
Right hand to the body from Froch, left hook to the head from George Groves. Once again they open up, an overhand right from Carl Froch on the ropes just above us, and it is all over. One single sharp right hand from Carl Froch. George Groves sent tumbling to the canvas on his left-hand side. No chance of beating the count. What a sensational finish to this, one of the great nights in British boxing history.
We could hear your excitement there, Bunce. That punch is going to live long in the memory.
Yeah, it was a fantastic night, a fantastic fight up until that point. More of a chess match than most of Carl's fights, to be perfectly honest. And bizarrely, some people in the 80,000 crowd were booing. And then Carl finished it, not just with the punch of his career, with one of the best punches I've ever had the pleasure of watching from ringside. It was a beautiful, beautiful end to a brilliant career.
These 2 Groves fights, Mike, what did they do for the legacy of Carl Froch as a fighter?
Well, I think in many senses they summed him up. And when he was talking earlier today about his decision to retire and how he said that physically he could still do it, but mentally the desire wasn't there anymore, he did refer to the first fight against George Groves, in which he said he was complacent and undermotivated and didn't pay enough attention to his training or to his opponent. But I think the way he came through that contest after being knocked down heavily in the first round, to still be involved in the fight through 6, 7 and 8 rounds and then finally finish it in the 9th round, again was testament to his great resilience and his ability to keep fighting back whatever the odds against him, whatever the opposition against him. And that was my reason for going for Carl Froch in the second fight in terms of who was going to win the fight. A lot of people favoured George Groves, having thought that he outboxed Froch first time round, he'd do the same second time round. But I thought if Froch could recover from that first round knockdown and still make it competitive through the rest of the fight first time round, surely he'd have a good chance second time round, and so it was. But I think in terms of the way he came back in the first fight, the way he finished the second fight, then that's a pretty great summation of Carl Froch's career and what he brought to the ring. In the final 90 seconds then, guys, where do we rank Carl Froch in the all-time great British boxers?
Mike, you go first.
Well, I would say, and I've said this all day today, that I judge Carl Froch across the last 3 decades, when there have been 4 world governing bodies and therefore more chances for champions and challengers alike. And across those last 3 decades, I rank him in the top 3 alongside Joe Calzaghe and Lennox Lewis. And like those 2, he's leaving the sport on a win, on his own terms, with his finances intact and with his reputation intact as well.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I'd throw Nassim Hamed in the middle there because I analyse his career, and I'll have Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank nipping at his heels, with Ricky Hatton supporting them just on the outside of a racehorse track.
Very brief final thought. Is this, Mike, a real retirement or a boxing retirement?
I would sense it is. At the age of 38, and him talking about fulfilment being completed, and I think his finances are in shape. The 2 key sources of motivation and temptation for fighters to come back are a lack of fulfilment, if that's what they feel, and a lack of money, and none of those apply to Carl Froch.
Fantastic sharing those memories with you tonight, Mike Costello and Steve Bunce, on the career and retirement of Carl Froch. That's us.